bitter criticism. This time, let's read something not related to. I like economy too. I like CGTN, and then Al Jazeera economy, and then Russia Today. Russia Today is too tough, you know. And maybe I'm too soft. The question is, Russia Today is always fighting, you know. Oh, that's nice, you know. This is a serious world. They have been facing terrible turmoil since 2014, since forever, you know. Russia is a big deal. Russia is the real deal. I mean, the geography is not easy at all. Russian geography, the real deal. If Russia will be a fighter, a heavyweight boxer, it will be Holiday for sure. Anyway, there's live updates in Palestine. The genocide is still going. I was listening breaking news. Yeah, breaking news channel. The beautiful lady, the journalist said, Holocaust. It's been happening a Holocaust in Palestine. That's fair. That's fair. It's more than a genocide. It's a Holocaust. The Palestinian Holocaust. But as Holocaust and genocide are too dire for me, for my sanity, for my good humor, for my well-being, I'm going to read some economy, and as you saw, news about China. US-China hail, quote, substantial progress made in tariff talks in Geneva, and there's the photograph. The photograph subtitle says, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on the left and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer speak to the media after talks between senior U.S. and Chinese officials on tariffs and the residence of the permanent Swiss ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva on May 11. So, Switzerland, US, China, economy, and there's another subtitle, not a photograph subtitle, but introduction. The two countries have said they will issue a joint statement on the talks on Monday, May 11, 2025. Beijing and Washington have both hailed the progress made at the end of a weekend of closed-door discussions in Switzerland aimed at de-escalating trade tensions sparked by U.S. President Donald Trump's aggressive worldwide tariff rollout in March and China's retaliation. Following the talks on Sunday at the Geneva Villa of the Swiss ambassador to the United Nations, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told reporters, quote, "I'm happy to report that we have made substantial progress between the United States and China in the very important trade talks." End quote. Yeah, you know, the U.S. have to admit lost. The U.S. should admit they are lost. They have lost. They have lose. I mean, they lose the history. They lose history. Anyway, quote, the talks were productive, end quote, he added. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, who also took part in the 2 days of closed-door talks with Chinese Vice President He Lifeng, said that the differences between the sides were, quote, not so large as maybe thought, end quote. He Lifeng also lauded that he called, quote unquote, important progress in the trade talks with the US. Speaking to reporters in Geneva, he said the atmosphere of the talks with Besson and Greer had been candid, in-depth and substantive, echoing similar language from the US delegation. Both countries said they would put out a joint statement on the talks on Monday. After the first day of negotiations, Trump had posted on his social network Truth Social that the discussions had been, quote unquote, very good, describing them as a, quote, a total reset negotiated in a friendly but constructive manner, end quote. Beijing had yet to comment Sunday, but on Saturday, Chinese state news agency Xinhua described the talks as, quote, an important step in promoting the resolution of the issue, end quote. The Chinese delegation was expected to speak to the media on Sunday evening. The meetings marked the first time that senior officials from the world's 2 largest economies have met face-to-face to tackle the topic of the trade since Trump's slapstick new levies on China last month, sparking a robust retaliation from Beijing. So you have a very specific vocabulary over there. New leaves, I guess leaves, I don't know, sanctions, yeah. Quote, the talks reflect that the current state of the trade relations with these extremely high tariffs is ultimately in the interest of neither the United States nor China, end quote. Citigroup Global Chief Economist Nathan Sheets told news agency AFP he called the tariffs a, quote unquote, lose-lose proposition, end quote. The tariffs imposed by Trump on the Asian manufacturing giant since the start of the year currently total 145%, with cumulative US duties on some Chinese goods reaching a staggering 245%. Oh. And says, subtitle, keeping expectations low. In retaliation, China put 125% tariffs on US goods. Ahead of the meeting, Trump signaled he might lower the tariffs, suggesting on social media that an, quote, 80% tariff on China seems right, end quote. However, his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, later clarified that the US will not lower tariffs unilaterally, as China will also need to make concessions. Going into meeting, both sides played down expectations of a major change in trade relations. Besson underlined a focus on, quote unquote, de-escalation and not a, quote unquote, big trade deal, end quote. While Beijing insisted that the US had to ease tariffs first. The fact that the talks are even happening, quote, is good news for business and for financial markets, end quote, said Gary Hofbauer, a senior non-resident fellow at the Patterson Institute for International Economics. But Hofbauer cautioned that he was, quote, very skeptical that there will be any return to something like normal US-China trade relations, end quote. Even a tariff rate of 70 to 80% will still potentially halve bilateral trade, he said. Among some of the more moderate Trump officials, such as Besson and U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, quote, "There's a realization that China is better equipped to deal with this trade war than the U.S., end quote, said Hofbauer. The Geneva meeting comes after Trump unveiled a trade agreement with the United Kingdom on Thursday, the first deal with any country since he unleashed his blitz of global tariffs, but which maintains a 10% baseline levy on most British goods. Following the US-UK trade announcement, analysts have voiced pessimism about the likelihood that negotiations will lead to any significant changes in the US-China trade relationship. In his Truth Social post, Trump claimed the talks had made, quote-unquote, great progress. We want to see, for the good of both China and the US, an opening up of China to American business, he said. Source news agencies. What a way to negotiate, anyway. Fact-checking Trump's claim of securing $10 trillion in investment for US. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. China, US hold talks on tariffs in first bid to de-escalate trade war. That's better. I'm going to see this one. This, like the same subject, a very important subject nowadays, isn't it? U.S. Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent leaves his hotel for a meeting with Chinese officials on tariffs in Geneva on May 10, 2025. China-U.S. hold talks on tariffs in first bid to de-escalate trade war. Analysts have low expectations of a breakthrough, but host Switzerland hopes, quote-unquote, roadmap will emerge. May 10, yesterday. China's trade envoy He Lifeng met United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Switzerland for talks aimed at easing a trade war between the superpowers that is roiling global markets. The talks ended late on Saturday and will continue on Sunday, according to a source familiar with the talks. The Reuters news agency reported. The first official engagement since the U.S. slapped a 145% tariff on Chinese goods, prompting a retaliatory 125% duty from China, began earlier Saturday at an undisclosed location in Geneva, Switzerland, according to the Chinese state news agency Xinhua. A motorcade of black cars and vans was seen leaving the home of the Swiss ambassador to the United Nations in the suburb of Cologne, the Associated Press news agency reported. A diplomatic source speaking to AP, on condition of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the meeting, said the sides met for about 2 hours before departing for a previously arranged luncheon. The talks then continued into the evening. The trade dispute, which effectively amounts to a mutual boycott of products, was prompted by US President Donald Trump last month when he announced sweeping duties on almost every country in the world, which are now subject to a 90-day reprieve while negotiations take place. That's funny because even Chile, this slaves country, we got here 10%, and imagine a country suffering since forever, and slaves, doing whatever the United States want from us, giving all, and then we have 10% tariffs too. I wonder how much tariffs South Korea got. South Korea is another slave country. But anyway, I don't remember where I left. Maybe I'm going to read again this. The trade dispute, which effectively amounts to a mutual boycott of products, was prompted by the US. Experts believe China may be looking for the same 90-day waiver as well as a reduction of the 145% tariff. Trump suggests that it could be reduced to 80%, saying in a Truth Social post on Friday that the amount, quote unquote, seems right. Trump's press secretary Caroline Leavitt said on Friday that the US will not lower tariffs unilaterally, adding that China will need to make concessions as well. Besson has said the meetings in Switzerland will focus on, quote unquote, de-escalation. Quote, the best scenario is for the two sides to agree to de-escalate on the tariffs at the same time, end quote, said Sung Yum, director of the China program at the Washington, D.C. based Stimson Center, adding even a small reduction will send a positive signal. Quote, it cannot just be words, she said. And there's a photograph. US Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said that Donald Trump's tariffs are creating, quote, a great deal of uncertainty, end quote. It's actually a video subtitle. Distrust running high. Trump has justified the punitive tariff by citing unfair trade practices and accusing Beijing of failing to curb the export of chemicals used to produce fentanyl, a lethal synthetic opioid. China, for its part, says it will not bow to, quote-unquote, imperialists and bullies. With distrust running high, both sides have been keen not to appear weak, and economic analysts have low expectations of a breakthrough. Trump has suggested the discussions were initiated by China. Beijing said that US requested the discussions and that China's policy of opposing US tariffs had not changed. Swiss Economy Minister Guy Parmelin met both parties in Geneva on Friday and said the fact that the talks were taking place was already a success. Quote, if a roadmap can emerge and they decide to continue discussions, that will lower the tensions, end quote, he told reporters on Friday, source news agencies. Published on Al Jazeera English. I guess I'm going to read this one. Trump. And there's a more interesting guess. Two interesting news. Once a woman says, I don't have the cash to pay for these tariffs, US small business suffers. Maybe we're going to read the Trump one. I have zero idea about this one. Explainer. Fact-checking Trump's claim of securing $10 trillion in investments for US. And there's a photograph of Donald Trump. The text of the photo says, US President Donald Trump speaks with reporters as he signs executive orders and proclamations on May 4th in the Oval Office of the White House in Washington, D.C., the United States. Not so relevant, the text of the photo. The White House reports $5.1 trillion in promises investments, with 4.3 trillion newly pledged. Experts say $2.1 trillion may not fully happen. This article is by Madison Sopek Louis Jacobson from this very day, May 11. Since returning to the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump has touted corporate and foreign U.S. investment announcements as proof he is ushering in, quote-unquote, the golden age of America. On January 21, Trump said that before he had finished the, quote-unquote, first full business day, end quote, of his second term, the United States had, quote, already secured nearly $3 trillion of new investments, end quote. On April 2nd, he said, quote, it looks like we are going to have about $6 trillion of investments. 6 days later, Trump told National Republican Congressional Committee dinner attendees that the investment total was, quote, not revised up to about $7 trillion. During an April 30 News Nation town hall, Trump speculated that, quote, it could be more than $8 trillion. From where? On May 4, Trump told Kristen Welker, the host of the NBC News program Meet the Press, quote, I think we probably have close to $9 trillion of investments coming into this country, end quote. Trump is funny. And there's a video, Trump downplays recession fears after U.S. economy shrinks in the first quarter. I guess that's a lot of money, but they owe more money, you know. There's the public debt is so much higher. Anyway, so $10 trillion will not solve nothing. On May 6th, Trump told reporters, I think the real number could be $9 or $10 trillion, end quote. Finally, on May 8th, Trump said, we have now close to $10 trillion. Think of that, 10 trillion in investment. We are talking about essentially 2 months. That's far beyond the figures the White House has released publicly. He tallied the White House public lists of investments. He tallied the White House public list of investments. They amount to $2.1 trillion in corporate investments, or at most $5.1 trillion when including promised investments from other countries. Experts cautioned that he promised that the promised corporate investments are not guaranteed to materialize in full or during Trump's presidency, and some of them will have occurred regardless of who was president. Trump isn't the first to overstate new investments on his watch. Outgoing U.S. President Joe Biden said in 2024 that his Bipartisan Chips and Science Act had attracted $64 billion in private investments. Economists told PolitiFact that Biden's numbers were based on what companies had announced, which is not the same as dollars already spent. Roman V. Yampolsky, a University of Louisville professor and specialist in artificial intelligence, which dominates the promised investments Trump cited, said, quote, historically large-scale investment announcements often overpromise and underdeliver. There is a performative element to them, especially in politically charged contexts. They function as political theater as much as economic commitment, end quote. White House lists do not match Trump words. And this article is huge. I have no time for it, but I got the point. Oh, it's absolutely gigantic. Look.